I spent $25,000 on my son's wedding, and when the night came, when he stood with the microphone in his hand, he looked out at the crowd and raised a toast to his father-in-law, saying he was the man who made it all possible. Not one word about me. Not one thank you, just a smile in that direction as if I had never given a thing. And in that moment, my chest tightened so hard I thought I might not make it through the evening. But I kept my hands steady, I clapped with everyone else, and I stayed quiet, though deep inside I already knew silence would not be the end of my story. Thank you for watching and staying with me. It means more than you know. And before I go further, let me ask you something. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because I want to know who is sitting with me through this story. It gives me strength to share these words. Now let me take you back to that night, because when I clapped along with everyone else, I felt a kind of hollowness inside. The kind that comes when the people you love most act as if you are invisible. I sat there with my head bowed, just enough to hide the sting in my eyes. I thought about the hours I worked, the overtime I forced these old hands through, the savings I drained to make that day shine, and yet in front of everyone I was left nameless. It hurt in a way money never could. And while I kept silent, my heart whispered to me that this was not the end, that one day soon I would find a way to show him what it truly costs to erase a father from his own story. I remember sitting in that hall after the toast was done, the music playing, the laughter echoing across the tables, people dancing with glasses raised high, and yet for me, it was as if the walls were closing in. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat louder than the band, because all I could think about was how easily my name had been erased from that moment, how quickly my sacrifice had been turned into someone else's glory. And I told myself to swallow it down, to keep my face calm, because it was his wedding and I did not want to cast a shadow. But inside me something shifted. A small crack that spread deeper. The more I thought about everything I had done leading up to that night. I thought about the months before, when I dipped into the savings account I had guarded for so many years. Money I had put away for my old age. Money that was supposed to keep me safe when my body grew too tired to keep working. And yet when he came to me with big eyes and bigger dreams, I didn't hesitate. I told him I would help. I told him I would make sure his wedding was everything he and his bride wanted. I spoke with the venue, I signed the contracts, I paid for the flowers, the catering, even the suits he and his groomsmen wore. Every signature on those bills was mine, and every penny that left the bank carried the weight of my name. I did not do it for recognition, I did it because I thought that is what a father does. I thought that when the moment came, he would look at me with pride and gratitude, and maybe even say in front of everyone that he knew what it had cost me, not just in dollars, but in the years I worked with my back bent and my hands rough. But instead I heard him praise another man, a man who already had more money than he could ever spend. A man who looked down at me from across the room with that smug little smile, as if he had won something, as if he had taken my place in my own son's life. I sat there replaying it over and over, asking myself if I had been blind all along, if perhaps my son had grown so comfortable with my giving that he believed it was nothing, that he believed it did not count because it came from me, and that thought stung more than any insult ever could. It made me feel as though my love had been mistaken for weakness, my sacrifice mistaken for duty, and I told myself quietly, without saying a word to anyone, that silence might be my shield for now. But one day soon I would hold up a mirror to that moment and let him see the truth he tried to bury. The days that followed that wedding were heavy on me, not because of the noise or the lights or the long hours I had to sit through, but because of the quiet that came afterward, the kind of quiet that settles deep in your chest when you replay a moment again and again and cannot shake the weight of it. I would wake up in the night and still hear his voice thanking his father-in-law. Those words echoing as if they were meant to erase me from the story altogether. And I would lie there staring at the ceiling, wondering how we had reached a point where my sacrifices were treated as nothing more than air. I remembered the early mornings when I dragged myself out of bed long before the sun, when I worked overtime even when my bones begged for rest, all because I wanted to give him something better than I ever had. And it was not just the wedding. It was school fees. It was the car he drove when he was young. It was the roof over his head when he had nowhere else to go. And yet none of those things were spoken of. None of those years mattered when he stood before a room filled with people. It was as if all my effort was invisible, swept under the rug of his new life. I thought back to the first conversation we had when he told me about the wedding plans. I remember the excitement in his voice, the way he talked about a grand hall with chandeliers, music that would fill the air, food that would overflow from the tables. And when he spoke, I looked at him and saw the little boy I once raised, now dreaming like a man who thought the world was already his. And I told him I would help. I told him not to worry about the cost, because I had been saving for years, and I wanted him to have the kind of wedding I never could afford for myself. I wanted him to feel proud, to walk down the aisle and hold his head high, believing that his family had given him the best start possible. I went with him to meetings, I wrote the checks, I signed every paper that made those dreams real. And when the bills came, I paid them without question. Even when I knew it meant I would be left with almost nothing for myself. I smiled through it all because love is not measured in coins. It is measured in what you are willing to give up so someone else can shine. But standing at that reception, watching the way he looked only toward his father-in-law, listening to the applause that followed those false words, I felt something break. It was not a loud shattering. It was a quiet crack, the kind that happens deep inside where no one else can see it, a wound that bleeds in silence. I kept telling myself maybe it was a mistake, maybe in the rush of the moment he simply forgot. But that excuse rang hollow the more I thought about it. Because a man does not forget the hand that carried him. A man does not forget the roof that sheltered him. And gratitude does not slip away like smoke unless pride has pushed it aside. I watched him dance with his bride. I watched the smiles on their faces. And I could not shake the image of myself as a ghost in the room, present but unseen, clapping but unacknowledged. The man who gave but was written out of the story so another could be praised. When the music ended and the hall grew quiet again, I walked out with the rest of the family. I smiled at those who passed me. I nodded when people told me what a beautiful event it was. And I said nothing because I knew words would betray the storm inside me. I carried that silence all the way home, and when I closed my door behind me, I finally let myself sit down. I placed my hands on the table and stared at the skin worn thin from years of labor. And I thought about how these hands had built so much for him, how they had carried weight, hammered wood, lifted boxes, and written checks. And yet tonight, they were hands no one saw, hands no one thanked. And it was there, in that quiet house, that I told myself I would not raise my voice in anger, I would not beg for recognition, I would let silence speak for me, but not in the way they expected, because silence can be louder than any shout if you know how to use it. And I began to imagine the moment when he would finally see the cost of pretending I gave him nothing. The moment when every bill and every receipt would rise back up like a shadow he could no longer ignore. The more I sat in that house thinking, the more the memories came back. Not just of the wedding night, but of all the little moments that had built the path to it. Moments when I ignored the signs because my heart told me to believe in him. I remembered times when he called late at night, saying he was short on rent, and I quietly covered it without ever asking for repayment. I remembered when his car broke down on the side of the road, and I paid the mechanic with the little I had tucked away for emergencies. I remembered when he needed help with his first apartment, and I gave him money to furnish it so he would not have to sleep on the floor. All of it done with the thought that one day he would understand. One day he would see that a father's love is written not in words, but in sacrifice. Yet what cut me deeper was realizing that he had grown used to it. That maybe in his eyes it was nothing special anymore. Maybe he thought that was simply my duty. That no matter how much it drained me, I would always stand behind him with open hands. And that thought made me ache more than any insult could. Because love should never be mistaken for weakness. I thought about his bride's family and how they carried themselves, with their polished shoes and proud smiles, their loud voices about business deals and vacations, their way of looking at me as if I was an old man with nothing left to give. And I realized how easily he slipped into their world, how quickly he learned to present himself as if he belonged there, and how convenient it must have been to let them believe her father had paid for everything, as if their wealth had carried him into that hall, as if I was no more than a guest among strangers. That realization burned inside me. It made the silence heavier, because I knew he had made a choice that night, a choice to erase me in order to impress others, a choice to trade truth for pride, and I could not forget it, no matter how hard I tried. Still, I carried myself with calm. I did not confront him or demand answers. I let the days stretch into weeks. I spoke gently when he called. I asked how the honeymoon went. I listened when he told me about their smiles and the places they had visited, and I held back the storm that wanted to rise in my chest, because sometimes patience is sharper than anger. Sometimes waiting is the most powerful answer of all. And while I listened, I was already preparing in my mind. I was already setting the stage for the moment when truth would come back to him, not as words, but as weight, a weight he would have no choice but to carry. Because every dollar has a trail, every signature has a name, and mine were written on all of it. The weeks rolled on, and I tried to let life settle, but the thought never left me. It stayed with me when I woke in the morning. It followed me as I drank my coffee. It weighed on me when I sat in the quiet evenings, and each time I remembered his voice lifting up another man while ignoring the father who had carried him all those years. It grew heavier, like a stone pressing deeper into my chest. I thought about the way he smiled in that hall, the way he raised his glass so confidently as if the lie he spoke was truth, and how everyone believed it, because why would they doubt it? And the more I thought, the more I understood that silence might have protected him that night, but it would not protect him forever, because sooner or later, bills arrive, debts come due, and truth has a way of standing in the doorway. Even when you try to bar it out. I began looking at the receipts I had tucked away, every one of them signed in my hand, every payment made with my account, and I placed them neatly in a folder, not out of anger, but out of certainty, because I knew the day would come when he would need me again, when he would come with that familiar tone of desperation, asking for help, hoping I would reach into my pocket like I always had. And that would be the moment when I would place those papers before him and let him see with his own eyes what he had denied. I did not rush it. I did not plan with bitterness. I simply waited, because patience is a weapon sharper than any blade. And I have learned over the years that silence can echo louder than shouting if you hold it long enough. During that time, I also thought back to the man I used to be, the young worker who came home with grease on his hands and sweat on his brow, who saved coins in a jar on the kitchen shelf, who dreamed not of riches but of giving his family something better. And I realized how those years had been spent building a foundation, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, until finally there was something to offer. And yet in one night, all of it had been buried under another man's name. That truth hurt me deeply, but it also gave me strength, because it reminded me that while recognition fades, facts remain. And the fact was simple. I had paid for that wedding. I had made it possible, and no lie could erase that truth. There were moments when I nearly broke, when I thought about calling him and letting my anger spill out, telling him how disappointed I was, how deeply I felt betrayed. But each time I stopped myself, because I knew words would not carry the lesson. They would only start another argument. And what I wanted was not a fight. What I wanted was for him to face the weight of his choices without me raising my voice. So I stayed quiet. I went about my days. I tended to small chores around the house. I walked through the neighborhood with my head low, and all the while I felt the silence building inside me like a tide waiting for the right moment to rise. And then I thought about the family he married into, how they had looked at me across that reception hall, polished and proud, as if they owned the night, as if they had gifted my son his happiness. And I knew they too would one day see the truth, because when the bills arrived at their door, carrying my name and my signature, there would be no denying who had truly paid the price. The thought of that moment gave me peace. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the truth to be undeniable, to stand in front of him like a mirror he could not avoid. I wanted him to feel what it means to erase someone who gave everything, and to learn that respect, once lost, is harder to regain than any dollar you can earn. So I waited, and I told myself quietly, "Your time will come, the silence will break on its own, and when it does, you will not need to lift your voice or raise your hand, because the truth is already written in ink, sealed in receipts, and waiting in the shadows, ready to walk into the light." It did not take long before the moment I had been waiting for arrived, just as I knew it would, because life has a way of circling back and testing the choices we make. And one evening the phone rang with his voice on the other end, softer than usual, carrying that edge of worry I had heard many times before. He tried to hide it at first with small talk about how things were going, but I could hear the strain underneath. And soon enough he admitted the truth. The honeymoon was over, the glow of the celebration had faded, and now the weight of the bills was pressing down on him harder than he expected. He spoke about the catering company asking for their final payment, about the florist sending reminders, about the rental hall calling to confirm the balance due, and he asked me in that familiar way, the way that once used to move me, if I could help him just a little more, if I could cover the gap until he got back on his feet. I sat there listening, holding the receiver in my hand, and in that moment my silence was heavier than any word I could have spoken, because while he explained his troubles and begged for understanding, I could see in my mind the stack of papers waiting neatly in the folder on my table, each one carrying proof of what I had already done, each one showing the truth he had erased from that wedding night. My heart hurt hearing him, not because I could not help, but because I had already given more than he ever knew. And now he was asking, as though the slate had been blank all along, as though I had not poured out my savings for him just weeks before. I remembered sitting at the back of the hall watching him thank another man for my sacrifice, and the wound opened again, reminding me why I had promised myself not to speak too soon, why I had chosen patience over anger. And as he kept talking, explaining how urgent it was, how embarrassed he felt, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of calm that comes when you know your moment has arrived. I did not shout, I did not scold, I simply told him to come by the house, because I had something to show him, something he needed to see for himself. And when I said those words, I knew the silence I had carried was about to break, not with noise, but with the undeniable weight of truth written in black and white. The next day, he came to my door, his face carrying the same confidence he wore at the wedding, though now it was cracked by worry. He tried to smile as if nothing had happened, but I could see the unease in his eyes, the kind of unease a man feels when he knows the ground beneath him is thinner than he wants to admit. He sat at my table and began to speak quickly, explaining again how the bills were piling up, how the calls were getting louder, and how he just needed a little help to push through. His words spilling out in a rush, as if the faster he spoke, the less I would think about what he was asking. I listened in silence, my hands folded, my eyes steady on him, and when he finally stopped, I stood and walked to the drawer where the folder waited. The same folder I had prepared in those quiet nights when the memory of his toast still burned in me. I carried it back to the table and placed it gently in front of him. He looked at it with confusion, his hands hesitant as he opened it, and then his eyes moved across the first receipt, then the second, then the third, and I watched the color drain from his face as the truth unfolded line after line, every dollar paid, every signature written by me, not by the man he had praised, not by the family he had wanted to impress, but by the father he had left invisible in that hall. He tried to speak, stuttering, saying it couldn't be all me, that maybe there was some mistake. But the papers left no room for doubt. Each page was stamped with my sacrifice, each line a reminder of what he had chosen to ignore. And the silence between us grew so heavy that the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like thunder. I did not raise my voice. I did not lecture him. I simply leaned closer and said the words I had carried with me since that night. Pay for what you claimed. And the weight of those words landed harder than any anger could. Because it forced him to face not only the debt, but the lie. It forced him to look at me and see the man he had erased in front of the world. He lowered his head, his shoulders sinking, as if the air had been pulled from him. And I knew in that moment he understood. He finally saw the cost of that silence. Not just in money, but in respect. And there was no applause now, no cheering crowd, only the truth laid bare between us. He sat there, staring at those receipts as if they were written in fire, his lips trembling with words he could not form. And for the first time in a long time he looked small to me, not because of his size, but because of the weight pressing down on his conscience. He tried to lift his eyes to mine, but they dropped again, as though the truth on the table was too bright for him to face. And I let the silence stretch because I wanted him to feel every second of it. I wanted him to understand that this was not about the money anymore. It was about the respect that had been thrown aside like it was nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was broken. He said he didn't mean it that way, that it all happened so fast, that he was caught in the moment, and the words just came out, but excuses cannot cover a wound this deep. And I told him plainly that the moment he raised his glass and praised another man while ignoring me was not a mistake. It was a choice that told the world who he wanted to honor. And that choice had a cost. He begged me not to see it that way. He said he was proud of me, that he was grateful, but those words felt thin compared to the silence he left me with in that hall. And I reminded him that gratitude spoken behind closed doors is not the same as gratitude shown in the open. Because the world only heard one story, and in that story I was written out, erased, so another man could stand tall in my place. And that was something I could never forget. I told him that money comes and goes, that bills can be paid, and debts can be cleared, but respect once lost is not so easily restored. And as I spoke, I could see the shame covering his face, the same shame I had hoped he would feel when I chose silence instead of anger. He asked what he should do, how he could fix it, and I did not give him the comfort of an easy answer. I told him that fixing it was not about money, it was about character. It was about learning that every action has a consequence, that every word spoken carries weight, and that respect for the people who built your foundation should never be sacrificed for the approval of those who never lifted a stone for you. The room stayed quiet after that, the only sound his shallow breathing, and I knew the lesson had landed. Maybe not fully, maybe not forever, but deeply enough that it would follow him as mine had followed me. And I left it there, not with more words, not with anger, but with the truth standing silently between us, undeniable and heavy as stone. He sat there with his head lowered, his hands resting on the table, as if the weight of those papers had drained all the strength from his body. And I watched him search for words that would not come, because deep down he knew no sentence could erase what had already been done. He tried to mumble apologies, broken strings of words about being caught up in the moment, about the excitement of the night and the pressure of the crowd. But I stopped him with a look, because excuses were just another layer of silence. And what I wanted was not a pile of explanations. What I wanted was for him to truly feel what it meant to erase the man who carried him here. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes wander to the folder still open. The receipts spread out like open wounds, each line carrying the memory of a sacrifice I had made. Sacrifices that stretched far beyond the wedding hall. Sacrifices that had built his life step by step. And yet none of them had earned even a single word of thanks when it mattered most. I told him calmly that the hurt I felt that night was not the kind that fades in the morning. It was the kind that burns quietly. The kind that lingers because it comes from someone you gave your life to. Someone you raised with hope. And I wanted him to understand that trust is not endless, that respect once lost is a debt far greater than any bill on that table. He lifted his face then, his eyes glassy, and for the first time I saw something I had been waiting for. I saw recognition, the crack of realization that the silence he had left me with in front of all those people had cost him something far heavier than dollars. He tried again to tell me that he loved me, that he was proud of me, that he had never meant to hurt me. And I let him speak, But I reminded him that love and pride mean little when they are not shown, that the world saw him lift up another man, and in that moment the truth was buried under his words. And it would not have mattered what he whispered later, because the moment had already carved its mark. I told him I had not brought him there to fight. I had not placed those papers on the table out of spite. I had done it because I wanted him to see that silence is not weakness, that sometimes the most powerful lesson comes not from shouting, but from letting the truth stand on its own, undeniable and heavy. And I told him that when he chose to erase me that night, I chose to wait. I chose to let him carry the lie until the weight of reality came knocking, and now he could see the cost with his own eyes. He pressed his hands to his face, and I sat quietly, letting the silence stretch, because I knew that was the only way it would sink in. I knew no lecture could cut as deep as the shame he was feeling in that moment. I wanted him to remember this lesson every time he looked at another man and thought it was easier to honor wealth than to honor sacrifice. I wanted him to know that while money may impress a room, it is love, respect, and gratitude that carry a family forward. And without those things, even the grandest hall feels empty. I told him that one day he would have children of his own, and that they too would watch his actions, and they would learn from how he treated me, because respect flows downward as much as it flows upward. And if he did not honor the man who raised him, he should not expect honor when his own hair turned gray. He sat there trembling, and I could see he was torn apart, not by my anger, but by the calm way I placed the truth before him. And in that moment I felt a strange peace. Because I had not needed to raise my voice or strike my hand. I had only needed to wait for the day when the lie collapsed under its own weight. And as I rose from my chair and gathered the papers back into the folder, I told him one last thing, that respect cannot be bought with money or borrowed with pride. It must be earned and shown. And until he learned that, the weight of that silence would follow him, reminding him of the night he tried to erase his father, but ended up erasing himself in the eyes of truth. When I put the folder away and turned back to him, I could still see the weight in his shoulders, the heaviness in his eyes, and I let the silence sit between us, because sometimes silence teaches more than words ever could. He looked at me as if searching for mercy, but I wanted him to understand that mercy was not the same as forgetting. I wanted him to carry this lesson like a stone in his pocket, something that pressed against him whenever he tried to pretend it never happened. I told him that I did not want his money, I did not want repayment, because the cost of those receipts was never about dollars. It was about recognition. It was about the truth of who stood behind him when he needed it most. And the pain came not from what I gave, but from what he took away with his silence in that hall. I reminded him that respect is not owed simply because of blood. It is shown through actions, through the way you honor those who walked before you. And that night he chose to honor another man instead. And though the crowd cheered, though the applause echoed, the truth was that he had built his celebration on my sacrifice. And yet he let me stand invisible while someone else stood tall. His lips trembled as he tried again to say he was sorry, but apologies spoken after the damage is done are like rain on parched soil. Too little, too late. And I told him that his words now could not change what the world had seen. They could not erase the memory I carried of sitting in the back of the hall, clapping for another man while my own name was buried under pride. I said to him that he would need to live with that choice, and that maybe in time he would learn that truth always comes to light. Whether through bills, through silence, or through the eyes of the one you tried to erase. And I wanted him to see that the only way forward was not through excuses, but through change, because respect once broken can only be mended by actions, not promises. He lowered his head again, and the room grew so still I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, and in that stillness I felt the lesson settle like dust, not loud, not violent, but undeniable. And I knew he would carry it because he had no choice, because every page of that folder had already spoken for me louder than I ever could. When he finally rose from the table that day, I could see he carried something heavier than the folder I had shown him. He carried the truth he had tried to hide, the truth that no crowd could erase, And though he walked out of my house quietly, I knew his steps were slower because shame is a weight that clings to a man long after the door is closed. I watched him go with no words of anger, only the quiet knowledge that he would have to face himself every time he remembered that wedding night, every time he recalled the cheers that followed his toast, and every time he pictured me sitting at the back of the hall clapping for another man. In the days that followed, he called less often, his voice smaller when he did, and I sensed he was learning, not because I lectured him, but because the silence between us had turned into a mirror. And every time he looked into it, he saw the cost of his choice. I spent those days reflecting on my own life, on the years I had carried burdens for others without complaint. And I realized that a father's role is not only to give, but also to teach, sometimes through love, sometimes through patience, and sometimes through letting the truth weigh on the shoulders of the one who needs to feel it. I thought about how easy it is to take for granted the hands that built your path, how simple it is to let pride erase gratitude, and how dangerous it is to chase approval from those who never sacrificed for you while ignoring the one who gave everything. And I felt a deep sorrow but also a strange calm, because I had done what I could. I had shown him the truth without raising my voice. I had given him the lesson without striking him down, and now it was his to carry, not mine. There came a moment not long after when he came back to see me, his face softer, his tone different, and though he did not repeat the apologies he had tried before, I saw something in his eyes that told me the silence had worked, that he had thought about it every day since, and he sat across from me with no folder between us this time, only the weight of our shared history. And he told me that he wanted to do better, that he had realized what he had done, that he could not change the past, but he would not forget it. And for the first time since that night, I felt a small flicker of hope that the lesson had rooted deep. I told him again that money was never the issue, that what mattered was respect, that gratitude is the currency that lasts longer than any bill, and that when it is missing, no celebration, no hall, no toast can ever cover its absence. Because people may forget the flowers or the music, but the words spoken in public live on in memory long after the day is done. And as I looked at him, I told him one more truth, that every man must decide what kind of legacy he will leave, whether he will be remembered for the things he gave or the people he honored, and that one day he too would stand where I stand, older, worn, with children of his own grown and watching, and the way he chose to treat me would echo through them, teaching them how to treat him. And in that moment, I think he understood that this was bigger than one wedding, bigger than one night. It was about the line of respect that ties generations together, a line that should never be broken for the sake of pride. So I leave you with this. Respect is worth more than wealth. Gratitude is richer than gold, and silence, when used wisely, can teach lessons louder than any shout. I did not need to raise my hand or my voice. I only needed to wait, because truth always arrives, bills always come due, and lies always fall apart under their own weight. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this: never erase the hands that built your foundation. Never trade gratitude for pride, because the cost will be heavier than you can bear, and once respect is lost, it is not easily found again. And so that is where my story rests, not in anger, not in revenge, but in the quiet strength of truth. For I learned that sometimes the deepest lessons are not shouted across a crowded room, but spoken in silence that lingers in the heart. I gave everything I had because love guided me, but when pride tried to erase me, I let the truth stand on its own. And in the end, he saw what he had done, he felt the weight of it, and he will never forget it. Because some debts cannot be repaid with money, only with respect. Thank you for staying with me until the end. It means more than I can say. And I ask you to subscribe so you can walk with me again, for I still have many more stories left to share with you.